To today's episode of Vinyl Tales. I got a good one for you today. You see, today's song is one that I have no doubt that you know. Its intention was simply to get the group behind it a bit of a foothold, since the group had been blocked from getting any of their music released. Little did anyone involved at the time know, this song would do so much more. Thanks to nothing more than a teenage girl and a couple of very creative musicians, this song would cross the ocean, break dozens of records in mere days after its release, and not only bring a bit of a craze with it, but start a well-known phenomenon that lasted for years and influenced an entire decade of music. The group behind this song had problems with having a restricted reach for their music due to problems with record labels, but the release of this song changed everything. And they went down as one of the most influential and important groups in history. Learn about it and all kinds of more fun stuff connected to this one song on today's episode of Vinyl Tales. Back in early 1963, a new group of four guys had just released their first album over in the UK. This album was an instant hit, and it went straight to the top of the charts. All throughout that year, this new group was all that everyone happened to talk about. They were played on the radio, they were getting all kinds of news coverage, and they were even outplaying other bands, even though they were technically just the opener. They weren't the actual headlining bands. However, regardless of all this success, along with the fact that a new term had been coined after the name of the group to describe this new craze that had developed surrounding them, and it was growing quite rapidly, Capitol Records, which was the U.S. branch of the label that they were signed to, simply refused to release any of their music here in America. Now, as a way to combat this, the band's manager decided he was going to fix that little problem. He was going to try and overcome this little obstacle. So he came up with an idea. His idea was to simply force them to have no other option but to release their music. In order to make this happen, he contacted two of the band's members and told them to write a song that would appeal specifically to the American market. He was hoping that this song would get played over the radio in America and it would become so popular with the listeners that the demand would finally get their music released in the U.S. In order to create this song, Paul McCartney and his friend John Lennon went over to his girlfriend's house, walked down to the basement where the piano was, and they got to work. Back in 1963, Paul McCartney had just moved from his home in Liverpool to London. He moved in with his girlfriend at the time, who was an actress named Jane Asher, and her parents, where he lived for a while as a guest of her father, and he worked out of their basement. Her parents were a guy named Dr. Richard Asher, who was a renowned doctor from the Central Middlesex Hospital and named Munchausen disease in a 1951 paper. Her mom was a woman named Margaret Asher, Now, Margaret Asher was a professor at the Royal Academy there in London. But in her free time when she wasn't teaching, she also taught the oboe as well. She had a room in her basement that she had had all set up for her to teach the oboe in. And it wasn't very big, having been described as small and stuffy, nor did it have a whole lot of furniture in it either. Jane Asher herself, the daughter, said later that it only had a piano, an upright couch, and a sofa. It was all the furniture that this little room contained. But this little room was where Paul McCartney wrote a whole bunch of songs. You see, after he moved into his girlfriend's parents' house as a guest of her father, this small room was his base of operations. One afternoon, Paul McCartney was busy writing a love song for his girlfriend, Jane, and he almost had it finished. He had quite a bit of it done. And then John Lennon, his friend, came over and he popped on the song, and he helped him finish it real quick. All this time, while they're down there working in the basement, Jane is upstairs in her bedroom by herself, letting these two play around on the piano and get to work. Now, they wrote a lot of stuff that was just one-on-one, the two guys sitting at a piano, or eyeball to eyeball, as John Lennon put it, when he did an interview for Playboy magazine in 1980. They would just play random tunes on the piano, and while they're playing the music on the piano, they would just call out random phrases. If these random phrases that they called out seemed to fit well with the music that they were playing, or the instrumental part that they had already come up with, they keep it and they just make it part of the song. If it didn't seem to fit all well, then they throw it out and they just keep going. Apparently, randomness was a contributing factor as part of their songwriting process. While Paul McCartney and John Lennon were in the basement at the piano working on this new song of theirs, they were both playing things on the piano at the same time. They had already gotten some of the song actually written and created, but they weren't quite done with it. At one point, while they were still trying to figure out this song, they were playing the music and they were singing along, and Paul, at one point, plays a special chord on the piano. Now, this chord sounded so good in that particular spot that they stopped and they said, "Oh yeah, that sounded great. Let's go with that. That would fit perfectly right there." And that made the song. Now, after about an hour, give or take, Paul finally went and he grabbed Jane. He called his girlfriend downstairs. They had just finished their new song, and they wanted to play it for her to kind of see what she thought about it. They wanted her take. So she went downstairs to the practice room in the basement where they were at, and she sat on the sofa next to the piano, and she listened to them play their new song. After Paul and John played the song for her, they turned to her and they asked her what she thought about it. She told them that it was actually pretty good. But now the song was finished. The next step was to go and record it. So they got on the phone, they grabbed the other two members of their little group that they had created, and on October 17th, 1963, they walked into the EMI recording studios right there in London. The recording only actually took one day, but 17 takes later, their new song was now recorded, and about 4 or 5 days later, the mastering was all done. So This new song was all set and ready to go. It just needed released. Just before the new song that was supposed to catch the attention of the American listeners, to get them that foothold, was to be released, their previous single, She Loves You, had recently shot back up to the #1 spot on the charts because of an increase in media coverage for the band. Every day that passed, more and more people started listening to this group's batch of music, even though by this point they'd only released 1 or 2 albums. And this caused sales to go through the roof. But because of this craze surrounding the group, demand for a new song was quite quickly getting out of hand. News of a new song that was about to be released got out to the public, and EMI received over 1 million advance orders for this song. And remember, this is just over in the UK. At this point, they still haven't gotten that foothold in America. It's not very often that a song gets over 1 billion pre-orders, forcing the label to release it earlier than their original intention. But this got over 1 million advance orders, and it was released later that next month. Because of the massive amount of advance orders, as well as the delight of everyone involved with the group, from those 2 guys in the basement that wrote the song all the way up to the retail workers that sold the records in their stores, this song was released to the public, and it shot up the charts like a rocket. On November 29th, 1963, a new song by the Beatles was released. This new song was called I Want to Hold Your Hand. And only a week after its release, it knocked their song She Loves You off of the #1 spot, replacing it and staying there for over a month. Following the song's immediate success in the UK after its release, the group's manager was finally able to convince Capitol Records to consider releasing Beatles music in the US. The group had been scheduled to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show in the middle of January 1964, but the single, originally scheduled for a release coinciding with the appearance on that show, being January 13th, was actually released earlier than that by about 2 weeks, due to massive popular demand. You see, in December 1963, just shortly after its initial release over in the UK, a 15-year-old girl named Marcia Albert wrote in. She had seen a short clip of one of their Beatles songs being played, and she wrote a letter saying that she had liked what she had just heard and thought that this cool new group would do very well over here in the United States. Now, she wrote this letter into a local DJ, which was in Washington, D.C., where she was all based. She thought it would be really cool if her local DJ would be able to get a hold of one of their records and bring it over and play it over the radio for her to listen to over the radio right there in town. Now, the DJ's name was Carol James. And after the DJ Carol James got a word of this, he thought it was a pretty good idea. He decided to follow through with this little idea of hers and see what all he could do. So he went to the station's promotions director and asked to get a copy of the Beatles' new single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, flown in from Britain. When it eventually did make its way overseas, and into Carol James's hands, he got on the phone and he called Marcia Albert. He told her that if she made it down to the radio station by 5 o'clock, that he would let her be the one to announce the song. And so, Marcia Albert, only 15 at the time, went down to the radio station there in Washington, D.C., and introduced the Beatles to the United States for the first time, causing the start of Beatlemania. Now, at this point in time, the Beatles wasn't really what people listened to over here. People tuned into the radio and expected to hear things like Andy Williams and Bobby Vinton. So when they turned on the radio and I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles popped on, this new style of rock and roll music was what they wanted. They didn't want to listen to anything else. And so I Want to Hold Your Hand ended up getting played not only in Washington, D.C., but at radio stations in Chicago and radio stations in St. Louis. And it got played on repeat. And it was reportedly very difficult to turn on the radio and even get news, because almost every time you turn it on, you'd be playing the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand. Now, understandably, due to their original reluctance at releasing anything for the Beatles here in the United States, and then them basically being forced or having just giving in, saying, okay, you got us, we'll go ahead and release it. Since Capitol Records had finally agreed to actually release Beatles music in the United States and had already set up a time for them to be released, when they started hearing this song played all over the radios all over the country and starting the craze and making people want Beatles more and more, they got mad. And so they threatened to go to court and threatened to seek a court order to ban radio stations from playing this song over the radio at all. Now, of course, Beatles fans back then, during this Beatlemania craze of the 60s, just did what they always did. They ignored the threats, and the radio DJs just kept playing the song. Since Capitol wasn't going to be able to stop the spread of the Beatles or stop Beatlemania, they decided they'd just go ahead and hop on the train. They'd join the craze and use the publicity that this song had gotten to go ahead and release the song 2 or 3 weeks earlier than they had initially planned. It was originally planned for that release in the middle of January, coinciding with a appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, but now they had moved it to December 26th, the day after Christmas, 1963. And on that day, I Want to Hold Your Hand was now publicly available in America for the very first time. The demand for this new group and their hit song was unbelievable. New York City was selling 10,000 copies every single hour, and in just the first 3 days alone, it already sold 250,000 copies, and that number was still going up. People just couldn't get enough of this cool new song. It got to the point to where the demand for this song was so overwhelming that Capitol Records had to contact Columbia and RCA in order to have them press some of the records in their own pressing plants in order to keep up with the public's demand for this cool group and this new song. This song, having been officially released in the U.S. the day after Christmas in 1963, marked the start of the British invasion. A couple weeks later, when the album Meet the Beatles was finally released in America, the album massively outsold the single that came before. Yet this was, even technically being the second album in America by 10 days, this was the first album to feature the song as one of the tracks. This album outsold the single, and it started the Beatles' craze in America, altering the American music charts entirely. Because up to this point, the charts had been, people had favored individual singles more than albums. But when this Beatles album, Meet the Beatles, came out, in correspondence with the I Want to Hold Your Hand, it got flip-flopped. And they favored whole albums more often instead. 2 months later, after the release of this song in America, I Want to Hold Your Hand made its way to America and forced American labels to bring the Beatles over here. The single, at the 2-month mark, had already sold 3.4 million copies, and the album, Meet the Beatles, had sold over 3.6. And this is just in the first 2 months of being in the United States. This marked the start of a very successful career. This one song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Hop in the Pond, coming from humble beginnings. Beatlemania in the US, as well as the so-called British invasion of the 60s, started in December of 1963 when a teenage girl heard a clip of a Beatles song. She enjoyed that clip, that music, so much that she managed to convince her local DJ there in Washington, D.C., to try to get his hands on a copy of the group's newest single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, today's song that I picked. He contacted someone, had it flown overseas, and brought it into the radio station. He played it over the radio, and it was wildfire. This song was inspired by Paul's girlfriend at the time, Jane Asher, because it started as a love song that he was trying to write for her until John Lennon came over and hopped in to help him finish it. It got altered a little bit. It was supposed to just grab the attention of the average American listener and become so popular in the U.S. that it would finally get Capitol Records to agree to release Beatles music in the United States. But unknowingly to the people that originally came up with this idea and to the Beatles that wrote the song, they created a song that would do so much more than simply get them a foothold in another country. Its release in America was filled with controversy, but in the end, it started something that would go on to last and inspire for many generations to come. But that's all that I have for you today. This was I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles, released in 1963 at 2 different points, once in the UK, again over in the United States, when a little teenage girl got a hold of it. If you have any other cool stories or interesting facts about songs or albums, or even if you like this video or this stuff, go ahead and let me know down below. I will look into them stories. Some of them are pretty cool. In the meantime, like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. My name is Brandon. This has been Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl. And until next time, I will see you later.